Welcome back. Extreme weather conditions linked to climate change are raising concerns about global food security. For more on these concerns, I have Professor Yang Hee-dong from Ewha Womans University. Professor Yang, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
I also have Professor Elizabeth Robinson, Director of the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Robinson, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Also joining the session virtually is Miriam Garcia Ferrer, Spokesperson for Trade and Agriculture at the European Commission. Miriam, it's good to have you on. Miriam, can you hear me? Miriam, I think your audio is not turned on.
It is, huh?
All right.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Can you hear me now, Miriam?
Thanks. Yes.
Right, welcome to the program. Professor Yang, we'll start here in the studio then. Seoul recently recorded its greatest amount of rainfall in more than a century. And among, of course, the repercussions are the soaring prices of vegetables at the moment. Could we start with that reality?
Yes, even in a single day of August 8th, we had rainfall, daily rainfall, new record in the last 115 years. The rainfall rate was over 340 millimeters. When it comes to the hourly rainfall, it was about over 140 millimeters, which is a new record in the last 80 years. Well, the problem, we lost over 80,000 poultry and cattle in that single day due to that single rainfall. Well, the problem with this disaster is in July, the price of agricultural and livestock and fishery products increased by 7.1%. And particularly for the fresh vegetable, the price has increased over 26% compared to last year. And compared to the previous year, which is June, the price has increased by 16%. So this is a disaster. We had the drought in spring, we had the heat wave in summer, and now we had the heavy rain. The problem with this symptom is in July, our consumer price index has increased by 6.3%. And these products, I mean the agricultural and livestock and fish products, had contributed over 0.62 percentage point, and this proportion will increase to 1 percentage point in August. That's a big problem.
Right, and that is the problem here in South Korea. Meanwhile, Professor Robinson, the UK, for its part, began this work week with heavy downpours after weeks of unusually dry conditions. Could we start with about that recent rainfall there in the UK first?
Yeah, well, we've been having the complete opposite situation from that in South Korea. We've had the driest July in almost 90 years, following on from a series of dry months. And so, yes, it was great that we had quite a lot of rainfall this past week. But unfortunately for us, because the land is now so dry, because we've had months of low rainfall, we actually experienced flash floods. And so, the land should normally act like a sponge when it rains, but when it's so dry, the land is acting a little bit more like concrete almost. And so the water, and there we can see the pictures now, that this leads to flooding. And so we're in a situation where we have low aquifers, low rivers, low reservoirs, and yet we're experiencing flooding as well. And unfortunately, this rainfall is not going to be enough to get us out of a drought situation. We're going to need higher than average rain now for the next few months.
Right. Miriam, Professor Robinson just mentioned the drought in Europe. Now, I understand some pundits is claiming that the current drought there may be the worst in 500 years. Do you care to elaborate? And how does this particular drought perhaps compare to that recorded back in the year 2018?
Yeah, so indeed, it has been an extremely hot summer in Europe with unprecedented drought and heat waves that started early in the season. In the European Commission, we are closely monitoring the situation through the European Drought Center that already indicates that 47% of the EU land is in drought warning conditions, which means that it's at precipitation and soil moisture deficit, and also 17% of the land is in alert condition, which also on top of the previous one refers to precipitation and vegetation and crop stress. So we haven't performed a full comparison yet with previous years because the season is not over, so the drought event is still ongoing. But what we can see is that this is the most hot summer since 2018, which was the hottest we could see over the last 500 years. So the previous most warm event was in the year 540, and since then until today we haven't experienced such a hot season. And what we can see also in the long term, if no mitigation strategies are implemented, is that extreme droughts may become the norm by mid-century, and this is of course very worrying.
Right, of course it is. Meanwhile, Professor Yang, back here in South Korea, authorities have spoken about intentions to tap into their reserves to keep the local market supplied with essential food supplies, especially ahead of the Chuseok holiday, which falls in early September this year. Do you suppose these particular efforts will serve to perhaps contain the current price hikes?
Well, when it comes to the government control over the agricultural and livestock and fishery products, you can think about the three major mechanisms. The first one is they have their own funds, such as disaster insurance or price stabilizing the fund. For example, as for the vegetable price stabilizing fund, they have about 45 billion won, and they declare to add 10 billion won more, right, to increase this fund. And secondly, they have their own stockpiles, and third, they have their own partners, such as agriculture co-op, or the poultry associations or the forest associations. And the government may conduct the following three major measures to control the price. The first one is they may try to persuade their partners or the farmers to increase their shipments by using all these funds or the many inducements. And secondly, they may try to lower the perceptual prices by issuing, supporting the discounted coupons, etc. And third one, they may try to control over the orders in the distributor market, such as controlling over the price or whatever. Well, if you ask me whether all these measures will be effective, I'm somehow pessimistic because for example, I talked about the price stabilizing the fund, but it contributes only 2%. The overall, the fresh, the vegetables and agricultural products. So I will get back to this issue later on to increase the effectiveness of government control of these prices. But it's very, very risky because government is very concerned about the increased contribution of these, the vegetable prices over the consumer price index, and we need more measures to control these prices.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, back in the UK, Professor Robinson, prior to this week's precipitation, droughts were declared in several parts of England. Now, do correct me if I'm wrong, but I hear droughts are rather common in England, occurring every perhaps 5 to 10 years. And that being said, what makes this year's drought so worrisome?
So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the problems is that we already have low water conditions, whether it's reservoirs, whether it's rivers, or whether it's aquifers. And on top of that, we've had a series of low water months up to this. And so when we get to this drought situation, unfortunately, we find ourselves with sort of very few policy levers in a way to deal with it. So on the one hand, we've just heard about hosepipe bans that have been brought in, and London's getting its hosepipe ban on the 24th of August. But the real problem is we're sort of now dealing with very small amounts of water. And so there have even been sort of, conversations mooted about even restricting water access in other areas. And so we're in this difficult situation where, we need to think about how we manage our demand for water, but also how we manage our supply of water. And so I think we're in a particularly difficult situation now, but we even need to think forward to 2023 and next year about whether we're managing our water supply so that we don't find ourselves in a similar situation next year. So we need to think hard about supply management. And so that means, for example, do we have enough storage? And that's talking things like, do we have enough reservoirs? And then also in the UK, we have a lot of leaks. So we have a lot of water leaks. So it's about our water companies reducing those leaks. And on the demand management, we have to think really hard about how we use our water, whether we're using it efficiently, and what mechanisms we're using to ensure efficient use of water, whether that's regulation or whether that's pricing. And so it's really the cumulative impacts of low rainfall months, plus the cumulative impacts of whether we're not really managing our water supplies sufficiently.
And staying there in Europe, Miriam, what can you tell us about the impact of such adverse weather conditions on perhaps Europe's food security?
So concerns about food security are not new. We have seen over the last months an increase of energy and fertilizer costs, and this trend has been exacerbated by the Russian war in Ukraine. So high energy imports and fertilizers could already induce farmers to reduce yields during the next cropping season. So in any case, food safety is not an issue in Europe. We are largely self-sufficient. We are a big producer of food products, so that's not really a concern for the moment. What is a concern is food affordability, because this increase in prices is having an impact on consumers and also on farmers. And in this context, what we did is introduce a set of measures in March, just after the outbreak of the war, to really address in the short term and in the medium term food security and food affordability, not only in Europe, but also globally, because we are concerned on the potential impacts that it could have also around the world. And one of the measures that we introduced, for example, is to allow farmers to increase production, derogating the greening requirements by allowing to produce in fallow land in 2022 and 2023. But it is important in parallel to ensure that we continue to build a sustainable, resilient and productive agriculture sector in line with the European Green Deal objectives. If we look at specific crops, what we see already because of the drought season, for example, for grain, for fruits and vegetables, and for wine, is that because of the heat, because of these strong weather conditions, the harvest is being advanced by a few weeks. So it's happening before that plant. And this can, of course, have an impact in the harvest and the total production that is being available.
Right. Professor Yang, Miriam has pointed out that Europe itself is quite self-sufficient in terms of food security. Where does South Korea stand in terms of self-sufficiency with regard to food?
Well, you know, the self-sufficiency means the ratio between the domestic production over total consumption. We have to distinguish between the food self-sufficiency rate versus the grain self-sufficiency rate. Well, as of 1990, we had the food self-sufficiency rate that contains the livestock fat over 75%, and grain self-sufficiency rate over 42%. But now, in 30 years, those two ratios were deteriorated to 45% and 22%. In other words, most of the food is now coming from the overseas. Why? There are three major reasons. The first one is the farmland was reduced. In 1980s, our farmland used to be 2.3 million hectares. Now it's reduced by 30% to 1.6 million hectares. And number two, our farming population was reduced. And over half of the farming populations are over 65 years old. And number three, there are no economic, the beneficial reasons for farming business in Korea after WTO. Well, the annual income of the farming households reaches only 65% of the citizens. So, and as for the weight, the domestic the self-sufficiency rate is below 1%. So, and these are the major reasons why we have such a poor self-sufficiency rate in Korea.
Right, unfortunately.
Right.
Professor Robinson, as you mentioned, there are hosepipe bans in place in England as part of efforts to deal with the drought. And you also mentioned water leaks being a very big problem there. What efforts are being made to perhaps deal with these problems?
Yes, so the hosepipe ban indeed is a way of sort of ensuring that people don't use water for what might be considered unnecessary uses. So, watering your garden with a hose pipe rather than a watering can, washing your car, or filling up, for those people who have them, filling up swimming pools. Yeah, so at the moment we really are stuck with demand management in the short term. And there's not many levers that can occur. And, we've heard a lot of people talking about food security. And in the UK, we're facing similar situations where farmers don't have enough water. And you could imagine, a situation where farmers might even be asked to irrigate less, which would have implications for food security. So we'd be looking to sort of a trade-off between water and food security. So in the longer run, it really is about managing supply and demand. It's thinking about efficient use of water, and it's creating the right incentives for greater supply of water, greater management of storage on the one hand, and better demand management. And the classic sort of policy instruments about pricing and nudges and regulation. And we see sort of all parts of that in the UK.
Moving forward, Miriam, pundits say poor crop yields resulting from adverse weather may ultimately lead to stockpiling and trade restrictions. Do you share these concerns?
Yes, indeed. This is a concern, and the EU is working and calls on all international partners to refrain from any export restrictions on food, as this only exacerbate food security problems. So in times of shortages, it is a false good idea to stockpile or restrict exports with the aim to protect the access of your citizens to food. The result of such behavior is actually the contrary. What this creates is fueling the price increase and irrational behavior in the consumers and traders, that it leads to uncertainty and volatility of the prices. And at the end, collectively, everybody loses. So this is one of the widely accepted lessons from the past. We have seen that in previous price increases, that trade is the main buffer to compensate for a bad harvest. And we can see it already in the European Union, where we have a single market. And when there is not enough production in one member state, it can be compensated by the production in another member state. And trade is key, open trade is key to allow for this to happen. And that is one of the reasons, for example, that the European Commission has opened an infringement procedure to one of our member states that in the outbreak of the war decided to restrict exports of grains within the European Union and outside the European Union. What we are doing also in the European Union is to require member states to notify us their monthly level of stocks of key cereals and oilseeds to make sure we have a good overview of the situation and we can monitor very closely. But the crisis shows again that we need open trade, we need diversified supply chains, and we need this resilience to be able to cope with the situation.
Right, and staying with the words of Miriam, Professor Yang, what do you propose that Korea seeks to do to ensure a stable supply of food amid the challenges posed by adverse weather conditions?
Well, we can think about two major streams of the measure. The first one is we probably could increase the self-sufficiency rate, but it has very critical limitations because we have a very small farmland and most of the farming in the house are very old. Well, the government could increase the funds, the support, the farmland or whatever, but it's very, very limited. So the most of the effective measure may come from the enhancing our relationship with the foreign sources. The first, for example, at the moment, our dependency on very specific numbers of the import sources are very high. For example, as for the wheat, we depend over 80% of our import in the United States and Australia and Ukraine. And when it comes to the bean, we depend on the Brazil and United States, and dependence rate is over 90%. So we have to diversify the import sources. Number two, we should increase the overseas farming. For example, Japan has more than 2.5 times bigger the overseas farming land than their domestic farming lands. We only depend on import, so we have to add one more sources of acquiring the external sources. The first one, again, is diversifying our import source. Number two is increase the overseas farming land. So those are long-term and very critical long-term strategies.
Right, I see. All right, Professor Yang, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts today. And Professor Robinson over in the UK, thank you so much for joining us live. And Miriam, again, thank you for joining us from Brussels with your thoughts and insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.